What if the rise and fall of empires was never a mystery, only a pattern we were taught to ignore? What if Africa preserved a prophecy so unsettling that every dominant power had a reason to silence it? Not because it spoke of destruction, but because it exposed how power always ends when it forgets balance. Tonight, this story leads back to an African sage whose words crossed centuries without ever being written down the way conquerors prefer. A voice rooted in ritual, memory, and observation, predicting something most civilizations refuse to accept. No empire escapes its own excess. This isn't mythology for comfort, it's ancestral knowledge encoded in symbols, rituals, and warnings that echo through Egypt, the Bible, Mesopotamia, and even the modern world, if you know how to listen. Once you see the pattern, history stops looking accidental. So, as this revelation unfolds, listen closely. Not as a spectator, but as someone living inside the cycle itself. And before we go deeper, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're hearing this ancient warning from. They say every forbidden story begins with a question people were warned not to ask. Long before maps cut the continent into pieces, before borders and flags, there were African sages who spoke openly about one uncomfortable idea: no empire lasts. Funny thing is, history keeps proving them right, yet somehow that part never makes it into the textbooks. In the deep interior of the continent, where stone cities once breathed with ritual smoke and iron rang against anvils, knowledge didn't belong to kings. It belonged to memory, to elders trained to read the sky, the soil, the silence between events. Empires rose around them, confident, loud, convinced they'd cracked the code of eternity. That confidence was exactly what triggered the warning. During long nights of fasting and isolation, after rituals meant to strip the ego bare, a vision emerged. Not flames, not monsters, just patterns. Wealth stacking too high, power forgetting its source, sacred laws traded for control. The prophecy wasn't dramatic, that's what made it dangerous. Ironically, conquerors later heard echoes of this message and laughed. They'd say, "Sure, empires fall, just not ours." It's almost charming how every empire tells itself the same lie. Rome said it, Egypt said it, modern states say it with better microphones. And yet the question lingered, unspoken but alive. If the fall was never about enemies or weapons, but about forgetting where power comes from, then what stage are we in now? That question didn't fade. It waited quietly for the next layer of the story to reveal itself. Long before foreign chronicles tried to define Africa as a place without history, the land itself told another story. Vast trade networks crossed deserts and forests, carrying salt, gold, ideas, and something harder to measure: spiritual authority. Cities like Timbuktu and Jenne weren't accidents. They were outcomes of systems that understood balance, not endless expansion. In those spaces, geography wasn't just terrain. Rivers were living records. Stones marked alignments older than dynasties. Knowledge moved orally, shaped by rhythm and repetition, because memory was considered safer than paper. Paper could be burned. Memory had witnesses. This was the world the sage moved through. Not isolated, not primitive, but embedded in a continental intelligence that linked astronomy, ethics, and governance. Power had limits here. Chiefs ruled, but priests remembered. And when those roles blurred, history tended to crack. What makes modern historians uncomfortable is how organized this all was, without looking like Europe. No marble statues of emperors everywhere, no obsession with permanence, just systems designed to bend, adapt, and reset when imbalance appeared. That flexibility was mistaken for weakness. It wasn't, and somewhere inside that landscape, between river mist and drumbeat, the sense grew stronger. Something essential was being ignored by those hungry for domination. The ground itself seemed to know what was coming next, long before anyone wrote it down. The sage didn't carry a crown, a weapon, or a title that echoed in palaces. His authority came from something far less visible: initiation. Years of silence, observation, and symbolic death had shaped him into a vessel rather than a ruler. In many African traditions, the most powerful figures were the least advertised. Power that needs display was already suspect. His origin story was never fixed to one village or bloodline. That ambiguity was intentional. He represented a lineage of knowing, not a single man. Stories say he emerged after surviving a ritual that mirrored death itself: burial in darkness, breath controlled, senses stripped down to their rawest state. What came back wasn't fear, but clarity. From that clarity came an unsettling insight. Civilizations don't collapse by invasion first. They collapse internally, long before the first enemy arrives. The sage spoke of imbalance, when accumulation replaced reciprocity, when leaders stopped listening to the land and started speaking only to themselves. People listened at first. Elders nodded. Priests grew quiet. Even rulers paused, because the words carried a familiar weight, like remembering something you'd been taught as a child and later chose to forget. That was the danger. The message wasn't foreign. It was intimate, and intimacy makes people uncomfortable, especially those who benefit from silence. As the sage's words traveled farther than expected, something shifted. Attention turned into scrutiny, respect into caution. The question was no longer what he knew, but how long such knowledge would be allowed to circulate. The rituals tied to that knowledge weren't loud spectacles. They unfolded before dawn, when the air was cold and smells of ash and earth clung to the skin. Symbols were traced in dust, not to impress, but to remind. Circles for continuity, broken lines for warning. Nothing decorative, everything deliberate. Each symbol carried layered meaning. To outsiders, they looked simple. To the initiated, they mapped the rise and decay of power. A coiled serpent didn't mean danger, it meant patience. Iron buried in soil didn't mean wealth, it meant responsibility. These were lessons encoded to survive time, not applause. Sound mattered as much as sight. Low chants mimicked heartbeat rhythms. Drums slowed breathing, pulling participants out of urgency and into awareness. The ritual wasn't about summoning gods, it was about stripping illusion. You didn't ask for visions, you prepared yourself to survive them. What made these practices threatening later on was their refusal to separate spirituality from governance. Ethics weren't abstract, they were rehearsed, repeated, tested in ceremony. Leaders who skipped rituals were watched closely. Leaders who mocked them didn't last long, one way or another. Over time, these symbols began to fade from public space. Not erased all at once, just quietly sidelined. And when symbols disappear, behavior follows. The rituals went silent, but the imbalance they warned about kept growing, setting the stage for the first real confrontation. The conflict didn't arrive with fire or chains at first. It came as reinterpretation. Foreign tongues renamed symbols. Sacred practices were reclassified as superstition. What couldn't be controlled was mocked. What couldn't be mocked was suppressed. The shift was subtle enough that many didn't notice until it was already normal. As trade turned into extraction and alliances hardened into domination, the old warnings suddenly sounded inconvenient. Empires don't like mirrors, especially the kind that show decay before collapse. The sage's words, once repeated openly, were now whispered, then avoided altogether. Silence became safer than memory. Colonization later accelerated what had already begun. Ritual spaces were repurposed, oral lineages fractured. Knowledge that demanded balance was replaced with systems obsessed with growth. Ironically, the prophecy was unfolding exactly as described. Accumulation without restraint, power detached from ethics. There's a bitter irony here. The conquerors believed they were bringing order. The prophecy had already explained this phase too, when control disguises itself as civilization. History didn't contradict the warning. It followed it almost obediently, and buried beneath layers of imposed narratives, something endured. Not loudly, not publicly, just enough to survive. Fragments of language, gestures, stories told out of sequence, because when truth is dangerous, it doesn't vanish. It waits for the next opening. Much later, traces began to surface in places no one expected. Stone alignments that mirrored celestial events, symbols carved thousands of miles apart, sharing the same proportions. Patterns that made archaeologists uncomfortable because they suggested coordination where none was supposed to exist. Ancient texts added to the tension. Egyptian moral codes warning rulers against excess. Biblical passages describing kingdoms falling not by force, but by corruption. Mesopotamian tablets speaking of cycles, not progress. Different languages, same spine. Funny how that keeps happening. Some dismissed it as coincidence, others called it diffusion, a safer word. But a few scholars noticed something else. The African versions weren't copies. They were older, more structural, less obsessed with heroes and more with systems. That didn't fit the preferred narrative. Oral traditions filled the gaps academia couldn't. Stories from West Africa echoed myths from the Andes. Floods, towers, divine law violated, power collapsing inward. No ships, no maps, no official contact, just shared logic, shared warning. At that point, the question stopped being whether these connections existed. The real question became why so much effort had gone into pretending they didn't, and what else had been deliberately left out, waiting to be noticed next. By the time the modern world took shape, the prophecy no longer sounded ancient. It sounded familiar. Empires now wore suits instead of crowns, spoke of markets instead of gods, but the patterns stayed intact. Expansion without restraint, power detached from consequence. The same cycle, upgraded packaging. What once collapsed through arrogance, now eroded through abstraction. Responsibility was outsourced. Decisions were made far from the land they affected. The old symbols warned about this too. When power loses proximity, collapse accelerates. Not dramatically, quietly. Like rot beneath polished stone. Here's the irony few enjoy confronting. The prophecy never framed collapse as punishment. It framed it as physics. Systems that ignore balance don't get judged. They fail. Gravity doesn't hate buildings, it just waits. That idea is unsettling in a world addicted to control. Across the African diaspora, fragments of this knowing survived in music, rhythm, faith, and resistance. Not as nostalgia, but as intuition. A sense that something about the modern order feels unstable, performative, hollow. That feeling didn't come from nowhere. So the question circles back, sharper than before. If every empire before believed it had escaped the cycle and didn't, what makes the present moment so confident it's different? Or maybe the prophecy isn't about the fall at all. Maybe it's about recognizing the signs before the silence returns. What unsettled people most wasn't the fall itself, but the role Africa played in preserving the warning. While empires competed to erase their own endings from memory, African traditions treated collapse as part of renewal, not failure, transition. That perspective made them dangerous to any system selling permanence. Across generations, the prophecy shifted form. It hid in proverbs, initiation rites, funeral songs. Nothing explicit, nothing that could be easily targeted. Outsiders heard folklore, insiders heard instruction. That duality kept the knowledge alive without announcing it. This is where the record gets uncomfortable. Africa wasn't merely affected by global power shifts, it observed them, documented them in ways that didn't flatter conquerors. And when those records didn't fit imperial logic, they were dismissed as myth. Convenient, right? The irony deepens when you realize how often modern thinkers rediscover these ideas and brand them as new. cyclical history, limits of growth, ethical decay before systemic collapse, old wisdom, fresh labels. The source rarely gets credited, and somewhere within that realization, another layer begins to surface. If Africa has been watching this cycle repeat for millennia, then the prophecy may not be a warning meant to scare, but a guide meant to prepare. And preparation leads to a different kind of power, one that doesn't look like domination at all. There's a quiet reason the prophecy never named a final empire. Names distract, patterns don't. The sage understood that once people fixate on villains, they stop examining themselves. So the message stayed structural, almost impersonal, like a mirror no one could smash without cutting themselves. In that framework, collapse wasn't sudden chaos. It was predictable fatigue, systems stretched too far, trust replaced by surveillance, faith replaced by branding. The prophecy described this stage with unsettling calm, as if watching something age exactly as expected. What's rarely discussed is how often leaders were offered a choice at this point. Reform or denial, return to balance or double down on control. History shows which option usually wins. Power, once addicted to itself, doesn't detox easily. This is where the prophecy becomes uncomfortable for modern ears. It implies that intelligence alone doesn't save civilizations. Innovation doesn't either, only restraint does. And restraint doesn't trend well, never has, so the tension builds quietly. Not with wars yet, not with ruins, but with signs people explain away as temporary. That's always the cue. The moment when everyone agrees something is just a phase, right before it becomes irreversible. As the cycle tightened, the prophecy described a strange blindness setting in. Not ignorance, saturation. Too much information, too many signals, until meaning itself blurred. The sage warned that this stage would feel advanced, even enlightened, while quietly hollowing out collective memory. In older traditions, this was called the age of noise, when truth no longer needs to be hidden because it's buried under distraction. Ritual silence once trained leaders to listen. Now silence feels threatening. Empty space gets filled immediately. No questions asked. The prophecy spoke of symbols losing weight. Words like freedom, progress, security repeated until they meant everything and nothing at once. When language decays, accountability follows. You can't protect what you can't clearly name. There's an irony here that stings a bit. The more powerful a system becomes, the more fragile its meaning grows. The sage didn't predict rebellion first. He predicted confusion. A society unsure of what it actually stands for, yet fiercely defensive about it. And just beneath that confusion, another sign begins to surface. A quiet hunger for roots, for something older, slower, grounded. The prophecy hinted that this hunger would be the signal that the next phase was already underway. At this stage, the prophecy turns inward. It describes a return that doesn't look like nostalgia. No golden age fantasies, no costumes, just people sensing that something essential was misplaced and wanting to trace it back without knowing exactly where to start. Across continents, similar movements quietly appear, an interest in ancestry, in land, in pre-imperial ways of thinking, not rebellion, recalibration. The sage anticipated this too. When systems overextend, individuals begin searching for grounding instead of dominance. Africa's role here is subtle but central, not as a destination, but as a reference point, a place where memory wasn't fully severed, where fragments of cyclical thinking survived despite pressure to linearize everything. Growth, success, history itself. The irony is sharp. The same cultures once dismissed as behind now hold conceptual tools the modern world struggles to rebuild. Limits, reciprocity, continuity. The prophecy never claimed Africa would rule again. It suggested Africa would remember. And remembrance changes direction, quietly. It doesn't overthrow structures overnight, it weakens their spell. And once the spell breaks, the next layer of the story starts revealing itself, whether anyone is ready or not. The prophecy's later verses speak of a threshold most people don't recognize while standing in it. A moment when collapse and transformation look almost identical. Old systems creak, not because they're attacked, but because too many no longer believe in them the same way. The sage described this phase as the loosening. Authority still functions, markets still move, rituals of power still play out on screens and stages, yet something feels thin, like a drum stretched too tight. One strike away from tearing, even if the music keeps going. Historically, this is where empires misread the signs. They assume dissent is the danger when it's actually indifference. When people stop arguing and start disengaging, the cycle has shifted. The prophecy treated this moment with respect, not fear. It meant change was unavoidable. What's unsettling is how familiar this sounds. Voter apathy, institutional fatigue, belief outsourced to algorithms and metrics. The sage didn't need technology to foresee this. He just understood human patterns under pressure. And as that pressure builds, another element quietly enters the frame, not chaos, but choice. The prophecy hints that what follows depends less on collapse itself and more on who remembers what to carry forward when the old structure finally gives way. What comes next in the prophecy isn't destruction, but sorting. When systems falter, what was superficial falls fast, what was rooted holds longer. The sage spoke of this phase like a harvest. Not everything survives, but nothing is wasted. In African cosmology, endings aren't erased, they're composted. Old structures return to the soil of memory, feeding what grows next. That idea unsettles linear cultures that prefer clean breaks and heroic resets. The prophecy never promised a clean future. There's irony here too. The people least attached to dominance often adapt best. Communities that preserved ritual, rhythm, and reciprocity don't panic when hierarchies shift. They've seen versions of this before. History didn't start yesterday. This phase isn't loud. No single moment to point at and say, that's it. Instead, meaning migrates. Authority decentralizes. New narratives feel strangely old. The prophecy framed this as a rebalancing, not a victory. And just as the ground begins to settle, another question quietly surfaces. If something new is emerging, who will recognize it for what it is, instead of forcing it to mimic the old world it's replacing? The final layers of the prophecy speak less about structures and more about people. Not heroes, not saviors, carriers, individuals and communities who move forward with fragments of older wisdom woven into new forms. Nothing dramatic, just deliberate. The sage warned that the greatest mistake at this stage is imitation. When the new tries too hard to resemble the old, it inherits the same limits. True renewal looks unfamiliar at first, quieter, less centralized, harder to brand or control. Africa appears here again, not as a power reclaiming dominance, but as a compass. A reminder that continuity doesn't require conquest, that memory can travel without armies, that influence doesn't always announce itself loudly. There's a sharp irony in how this part of the prophecy is often overlooked. People expect fireworks at the end of cycles. What they get instead is responsibility, the burden of choosing what values survive when spectacle fades. And with that realization, the story doesn't close. It pauses, because the prophecy never claimed to predict outcomes. It only mapped conditions. What happens next has always depended on who listens and who dismisses it as just another old story. Before anyone could call it an ending, the prophecy made one last move. It folded back on itself, not as repetition, But as reminder, cycles don't close neatly, they overlap. Old warnings resurface inside new languages, new crises, new questions people swear they've never heard before. The sage understood something uncomfortable. Humanity doesn't ignore wisdom because it's hidden. It ignores it because accepting it would require restraint. And restraint has never been fashionable in moments of abundance. So the prophecy expected resistance, denial, even ridicule. That was built into the pattern. Ironically, this is where the prophecy feels most alive. Not in ruins or relics, but in conversations people avoid. In doubts that surface late at night, in the growing sense that progress without grounding feels hollow. The old language returns wearing modern clothes. Africa's role here remains understated. Not center stage, not pedestal, just persistent, a quiet archive of what happens when societies forget that power, without balance, always overreaches. That archive doesn't shout, it waits to be consulted. And as this cycle completes another turn, the tension sharpens, not around whether empires fall, but around whether anyone learns before the next one repeats the same mistake with a different flag and a louder voice. What the prophecy ultimately leaves behind isn't certainty, but awareness, a subtle shift in how history is read, not as a straight line of victories, but as a series of tests humanity keeps retaking. Each era convinced it will score differently this time. The sage never framed knowledge as salvation. Knowledge was weight. To carry it meant acting differently, slower, more deliberately, even when speed looked profitable. That's why the prophecy was never popular. It asked for maturity, not excitement. In this light, Africa's legacy feels less like something lost and more like something unfinished. Threads cut short by force, yes, but not erased. They remain available to those willing to listen without trying to dominate the meaning. There's a quiet honesty in how the prophecy ends without closure. No final warning, no dramatic last line, just a sense that the listener has been included in the cycle, whether they asked for it or not. Participation replaces spectatorship. And with that inclusion comes a final unsettling invitation, not to believe, but to observe, to watch patterns instead of promises. Because once you start seeing cycles clearly, it becomes impossible to pretend you don't recognize where the world is standing now. The prophecy doesn't end with reassurance. It leaves a residue, a quiet discomfort that follows the listener back into the present. Not fear, but recognition. The kind that makes familiar structures look suddenly fragile, as if their permanence was always an illusion everyone agreed not to challenge. The sage understood that the most dangerous moment isn't collapse itself. It's the pause right before it, when warning signs are visible but inconvenient, when systems still function just well enough to discourage change. That's when people choose comfort over clarity. There's irony here that cuts deep. The same civilizations that pride themselves on data, forecasts, and models consistently ignore the oldest pattern of all. Empires don't fall because they lack information. They fall because they refuse limits. The prophecy never blamed ignorance. It blamed excess. Africa's ancestral memory keeps surfacing precisely at these moments, in music, in spiritual revivals, in movements seeking meaning beyond profit and control. Not organized enough to label, not loud enough to dominate, just persistent enough to remind. And that persistence raises one last tension. If the warning has always been available, passed hand to hand across centuries, then the question isn't whether the prophecy was true, but whether ignoring it has always been a choice. What follows isn't prediction anymore, it's diagnosis. The prophecy shifts tone, almost gently, as if assuming the listener has caught up. By this point, the patterns are visible without explanation. You don't need a sage to point them out. You just need honesty. The sage spoke of a moment when societies start confusing motion with direction. Constant activity, endless updates, decisions made faster, not wiser. From the outside, it looks like momentum. From within, it feels like exhaustion dressed up as ambition. This stage was marked by one clear sign: reaction replaces intention. Systems stop choosing paths and start responding to pressure. Crisis management becomes a lifestyle. Long-term thinking gets labeled unrealistic. The prophecy treated this as a tipping point, not a failure. Ironically, this is when leaders talk most about vision, about the future, about innovation, yet everything is anchored to preserving what already exists. The sage called this the age of borrowed time, when structures survive on inertia alone. And just beneath that inertia, another tension builds, because borrowed time always runs out. The prophecy doesn't say how soon. It simply notes that when a society reaches this phase, the next shift no longer asks permission. It arrives. When the shift arrives, it doesn't announce itself with thunder. It comes as a reordering of attention. What once felt essential loses urgency. What was ignored starts demanding care. The prophecy described this moment as a quiet turning, like a river choosing a new channel after seasons of pressure. In African memory, this turning is guided by elders, not rulers. Those who watched cycles before recognize the signs early. They don't rush to control outcomes. They focus on continuity, preserving language, ethics, relationship to land, because structures can fall without erasing a people. There's an irony few notice. The more centralized a system becomes, the harder it is for it to pivot. Decentralized traditions adapt faster precisely because they never expected permanence. The prophecy framed resilience as humility practiced over generations. This is where symbols return, subtly reactivated. Not as rituals copied from the past, but as principles translated forward. Reciprocity over extraction, limits over limitless growth, responsibility over spectacle. Old ideas, surprisingly practical. And as these principles begin to surface in unexpected places, another question presses forward. If renewal doesn't look like conquest or dominance, will it even be recognized as power when it arrives? Or will it be dismissed until it's already reshaped everything underneath? The prophecy's final movement doesn't rush toward resolution. It slows down, almost deliberately, as if reminding that the most important shifts don't happen on headlines or timelines. They happen in how people relate, to land, to memory, to each other. The sage spoke of power returning to scale, smaller circles, local meaning, authority earned through care rather than force. To empires, this sounded like weakness. To those who understood cycles, it sounded like survival. History tends to agree with the latter, even if it takes centuries to admit it. Here's the irony that rarely gets said out loud. What endures is almost never what dominated. It's what adapted quietly. The prophecy never glorified collapse, but it also never mourned the loss of structures that refused to change. Balance doesn't negotiate. Across the African world and its diaspora, this awareness continues to surface. In community-led movements, in spiritual reclamation, in the refusal to measure success only by scale or speed. Not coordinated, not centralized, just aligned in spirit. And with that alignment comes the softest ending possible, not a conclusion, but a continuation. Because the prophecy was never meant to be finished, it was meant to be recognized. Each time the cycle turns, and each time someone realizes they're standing inside it, the prophecy closes the way it began, without spectacle. Like embers fading after a long ritual night, it leaves behind warmth, not noise. A reminder that Africa's greatest legacy was never domination, but remembrance. The ability to observe cycles without being consumed by them. What was buried under conquest and distortion was not lost. It slept beneath sand, rhythm, language, and silence. The knowledge that power without balance collapses under its own weight, and that renewal only comes when memory is carried forward with humility. This story doesn't end here because it was never meant to. Countless symbols remain undeciphered. Countless names remain unspoken. Many truths still rest beneath layers of time, waiting for ears willing to listen without the need to control. If this revelation stirred something familiar inside you, it's because ancestral memory doesn't belong to museums. It lives in people. And every cycle turns again for those paying attention. So stay close, subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and walk with us into the next revelation. Because the sands of time still hide many truths, and not all of them are ready to stay silent.